11,000 years ago, something screamed into existence at the heart of the largest civilization the galaxy had ever known. The Aeldari Empire, spanning the breadth of the galaxy, billions upon billions of souls bound together by psychic resonance so intense it saturated the dimension beneath reality itself, collapsed in a single convulsion. Not a war, not an invasion, a birth. Slaanesh, the fourth chaos god, tore into conscious existence from the collective psychic excess of an entire species, and the force of that emergence was so catastrophic it couldn't be contained within the warp alone. It punched through. It spilled into real space through the dying minds of the Aeldari, ripping open a region of space-time that corresponded roughly to the core of their old empire. The worlds at the center of Aeldari civilization, the most densely populated, the most psychically saturated, were consumed first. They became the Crone Worlds, dead husks drenched in chaos energy, some still holding relics and artifacts of the civilization that preceded the cataclysm, sealed behind a border where physical law no longer fully applies. The wound left behind is called the Eye of Terror, reportedly the Ocularis Terribus in High Gothic. Codex and rulebook material consistently describes it as a permanent warp rift roughly 20,000 light-years across, a nexus of psychic energy and physical space-time where the immaterium coexists with real space. It sits at the rimward edge of the galaxy, in the segmentum obscurus, to the galactic northwest of Terra. Inside it, time ceases to function as a meaningful concept. Matter, thought, and energy blur into each other. Planets exist within the eye, but each one constitutes its own bizarre sub-reality, shaped by whichever chaos god or demon prince dominates its inhabitants. The whole region is a maelstrom of psychic energy, impossible to navigate by conventional means. Imperial starships avoid the area for thousands of light-years in every direction. Ships traveling too close through the warp can be thrown far off course, caught in temporal whirlpools that carry them backwards or forwards in time, or trapped in limbo forever. An extract from the Galaxia Daemonica Perpetua of Jerome, by order of Inquisitor Dalma, dated 453 M35, gives one of the most widely cited descriptions in the canon. The Eye of Terror is a realm of madness and despair, where skies weep blood, ancient stars burn in multicolored flares, and the whims of the dark gods of chaos hold sway. Synonymous with discord, terror, ancient secrets, and insanity, no other place in the galaxy fills the mind with such dread and foreboding. For 10,000 years, the Imperium largely treated this thing as fixed geography, a scar on the star charts. The eye sits in the segmentum obscurus. You avoid it. The traitor legions live inside it. Chaos attacks come out of it. Cadia guards the only stable route through it. That's been the operating model since the end of the Horus Heresy. Scattered through both old and recent lore is a trail of evidence that this model has always been incomplete. The Eye's internal conditions have been shifting, its demon worlds mutating, its influence pressing against boundaries that were only ever held in check by technology older than human civilization. And after Cadia fell, whatever process was at work inside it accelerated beyond anything the Imperium had anticipated or prepared for. Go back to the origin, because the nature of the Eye's birth matters for understanding what it's been doing since. The psychic shockwave from Slaanesh's emergence was so immense it couldn't stay in the warp. It spilled into reality through the minds of the dying Aeldari, and the result wasn't a clean puncture. It was a region where the two dimensions bled together and never separated again. Other, smaller zones of overlap between the warp and physical space were created across the galaxy at the same time. But the Eye is the largest and most significant of these rifts. It covers most of the territory where the Aeldari Empire's heartland once stood. The Eye was created by catastrophe, not described in the lore as a deliberately engineered structure. It erupted from a catastrophic event, and the lore has never described it as having reached a final, settled state afterward. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, was the one who gave the anomaly its name during the early days of the Horus heresy. Imperial astrographers had originally designated it Cygnus X1 during the Great Crusade. The existence of the rift had haunted Perturabo his entire life. He looked at it and named it terror, not stability, not equilibrium. After the Horus heresy ended with Horus dead aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the defeated traitor legions fled into the Eye. For them, it became exile, sanctuary, and launching pad simultaneously. A place where reality bent to chaos, where the servants of the dark gods could rebuild, mutate, scheme, and plot revenge. More than 10,000 standard years of continuous habitation followed. The Eye became synonymous with the traitor legions themselves. The Death Guard worshipped Nurgle there, their bodies bloated and putrid, incubators for every plague in the universe. The Thousand Suns served Tzeentch from Sordiarius, the planet of the sorcerers, where Magnus the Red preserved the libraries of Lost Tizca by transporting an entire city through the warp. The Word-bearers preached the dark gospel from Sakaris. The Iron Warriors fortify Medrengard, a world with a black sun and a white sky, every trace of its original surface lost under mountains of impossibly high fortress towers, its core penetrated by plunging dungeons, great chaos warships tethered to the tallest spires. But look at what the Eye of Terror Codex material actually says about these worlds. Each world within the Eye of Terror is a demon world, warped and twisted by the whims of the gods of chaos and the powerful demon princes who rule them. That phrase, warped and twisted by whims, isn't a description of fixed terrain. It's a description of ongoing transformation. The worlds inside the Eye aren't frozen in the shape they held when the traitor legions first arrived. They're being actively reshaped, continuously, by forces that don't answer to physical law and don't stay still. The specifics make this concrete. Oliensis, a demon world of Slaanesh, takes the form of a morbidly obese man curled into a fetal ball. The planet itself is a living body. During the Abyssal Crusade, the Sentinels' Space Marine chapter made planetfall and began hunting goat-headed hedonists across its surface. But the raging combat stirred the planet itself, which swallowed the combatants into a chasm. When they re-emerged, the Sentinels were unrecognizable, transformed into the Corpus Brethren. Drakasi, dedicated to Khorne, features a planet-spanning sea of blood connecting cities built around gladiatorial arenas, ruled by a diverse class that includes demons, barbarian chieftains, Amazon-like huntresses, chaos space marines, and mortal men playing at nobility, all under the authority of Lord Ebendrake, a reptilian demon prince. Cathalon is a great burning lake crisscrossed with arching bridges of brass and bone, over which the legions of Khorne and Tzeentch have fought for aeons. These aren't corrupted versions of existing things. Seas of blood don't form by degrading oceans of water. Bridges of brass don't grow from geological processes. A planet shaped like a curled human body didn't start as a rocky world and erode into that form. The demon worlds of the Eye suggest a generative capacity, the interaction of warp energy and physical matter in a zone where neither set of rules fully applies, produces structures, ecologies, and conditions that have no precedent in the material universe. At the very center of the Eye lies a feature called the Byssos, described in foundational lore as a hole in the fabric of reality through which raw chaos energy pours out into the material universe. A wound within a wound, an opening inside an opening. If the Eye itself is where two dimensions overlap, the Byssos is where even that hybrid reality breaks down further. The Eye has a structure, and that structure has a deeper interior. Now consider the containment system that held it in check for 10 millennia. Cadia, the fortress world nearest to the most stable gateway out of the Eye, was the Imperium's first line of defense against chaos incursions. But it wasn't chosen arbitrarily. The Cadian pylons, instruments of Necron technology erected millions of Terran years before humanity even existed, created a zone of relative stability at the edge of the Eye. Their purpose, as part of a galactic-scale Necron project, was to sever all interaction between real space and the immaterium. In practical terms near the eye, the pylons calmed the rift in their vicinity. They didn't seal it. They suppressed its worst effects locally, making the region intensely dangerous rather than instantly lethal for ships and crews attempting to transit the Cadian Gate. The existence of those pylons implies something fundamental about the eye's nature. The Necrons constructed pylon networks across multiple worlds in the region millions of years before the fall of the Aeldari, as part of a species-wide effort to limit the warp's ability to bleed into reality. When the eye opened, the pylons happened to be positioned along one critical corridor. Their restraining effect on the eye's border held for more than 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence, creating the stable passage that made the Cadian Gate both the primary exit route for Chaos forces and the defensive choke point for Imperial defenders. Abaddon the Despoiler made the Eye the base from which his Black Crusades were launched. Over 10,000 years, he turned it from refuge into springboard. A long series of Black Crusades spread across 10,000 years. Each one burst from the Eye of Terror and smashed into Imperial space. Each one was devastating. And the Imperium, for millennia, largely treated them as enormous raids, bloody, destructive, but ultimately repulsed. The conventional Imperial reading was that Abaddon kept failing to breach the Cadian Gate. Later codex and campaign material reframes that reading. The Black Crusades are described as part of an overall strategic plan called the Crimson Path, intended to lead the forces of chaos from the Eye of Terror all the way to Holy Terra itself. Under this framework, each crusade wasn't a failed attempt to break through, but a deliberate step in a longer sequence, targeting specific locations, degrading specific structures, weakening the veil between real space and the warp along a particular route. The 13th Black Crusade, launched in 999 M41, was the culmination. Abaddon's forces crashed a black stone fortress, one of the most powerful weapons platforms in existence, directly into Cadia's surface. The fortress was already heavily damaged, actively being contested by Astartes' borders, and functionally lost as a mobile asset. Abaddon used it as a kinetic weapon instead. Cadia cracked. The pylons shattered. The suppression field that had restrained the Eye's border along the Cadian Gate for millennia collapsed, and the Eye of Terror responded. Lore compiled from Codex material states that in the wake of the destruction of Cadia and the Necron-built Cadian pylons that had long kept the growth of the Eye of Terror in check, the Eye actually began to expand across the galaxy. That phrasing is specific and important. Not chaos forces surging outward. Not the warp merely becoming more turbulent. The Eye itself expanded. Its boundary moved. The zone where reality and the immaterium overlap grew larger. Even before the pylons broke, the immaterium had been growing more turbulent in the final years of the 41st millennium. Travel and communication through the warp suffered increasing disturbances as the events of the 13th Black Crusade unfolded. But the destruction of Cadia was the rupture point. Eventually, a titanic warp rift tore across the entire galaxy, spreading from the Eye of Terror in the galactic west to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a galaxy-spanning wound that bisected the Imperium of Man. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The psychic light of the Astronomicon, the beacon that guides every Imperial ship through the warp, was dimmed by the rift's empiric fury. The entire far side of Imperial space, the Imperium Nihilus, was cut off from Terra's guidance. The period called the Noctis Aeterna, the blackness, saw countless worlds, fleets, and armies claimed by the darkness. When the shadow receded enough for any kind of order to reassert itself, the damage was already existential. Warp storms of unprecedented fury spawned across the galaxy. Some permanently circled the Great Rift. Others traveled in an almost sentient fashion all over the galaxy, obeying no known rules of solar current or winds. Temporal distortions, once largely localized to the Eye of Terror and other major warp storms, spread everywhere. Some worlds experienced standard centuries in an instant, others froze in time. Still others suffered constant temporal shifts. Worlds near the rift disappeared entirely or became demon worlds. The very laws of physics frayed at the rift's edges. The Great Rift and the Eye of Terror are related but distinct. The rift originated from the Eye, uses it as its western anchor point, but extends far beyond it. Making that distinction matters. It's tempting to attribute the current galactic crisis entirely to the broader rift and treat the Eye itself as yesterday's problem, a wound that tore wider and then got absorbed into a larger catastrophe. But the lore doesn't support that reading. The Eye remains an active zone in its own right, with its own internal dynamics. The demon worlds inside it continue to shift. The Baisos continues to pour raw chaos energy into the hybrid region, and the Cadian Gate, the immediate perimeter of the Eye, has become the most strategically critical war zone in the Imperium. The official Warhammer community preview for the 10th edition narrative expansion Eye of Terror, Reign of Iron, describes the current situation in blunt terms. While the bulk of the Imperium is distracted elsewhere, the Iron Warriors launch their bid to control the region of space known as the Cadian Gate, where a few Imperial holdouts still resist despite the loss of Cadia. Distracted elsewhere. The Imperium is fighting on every front simultaneously. Rabute Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade consumed vast resources to reinforce the shattered realm. The Plague Wars ravaged Ultramar. Hive Fleet Leviathan pressed the Blood Angels at Baal. The Imperium Nihilus burns without the Astronomican's guidance. While all of that is happening, the immediate perimeter of the Eye of Terror, the one corridor that, if fully controlled by chaos, opens a grinding march toward Holy Terra, is being held by a dwindling garrison. Agrippina, a mighty forge world, still operational, still producing war material, still holding against the tide. The Lexicanum summary of the Reign of Iron campaign book states that Perturabo's grand plan for the conquest of the Imperium has taken thousands of years to formulate, and its first step is to bring the Cadian Gate under his complete dominion. Those Imperial worlds that remain there, including the mighty forge world Agrippina, have been able to hold on until now. But the Iron Warriors must conquer the sector if Perturabo's plan is to begin in earnest. The primary Iron Warriors war host bearing down on Agrippina is led by warsmith Kravik Morn, described as a powerful warlord with a taste for brutal head-on assaults, famous for leading charges from his Land Raider at the head of his Terminator bodyguard. The military crisis is real and immediate, but the military dimension, Iron Warriors grinding against Forge worlds, is only the surface layer. Underneath it lies a more unsettling question that the lore keeps approaching without ever resolving. Is the Eye of Terror just doing what it's always done, but at larger scale because the pylons are gone? Or is something qualitatively different emerging inside it? No codex passage says a new entity is gestating within the Eye. No Black Library novel explicitly names what the Eye might be becoming. That honesty matters, because the lore-aware audience will know where canon ends and interpretation begins. But the cumulative weight of what the lore does say creates a pattern worth tracing. The demon worlds aren't stable. They're shaped by whims, continuously mutating, producing structures and phenomena, living planets, seas of blood, bridges of brass across burning lakes, that have no precedent in any other part of the material universe. The Baisos pumps raw chaos energy into the Eye's center. That doesn't prove a new singular thing is being born there. It does show that the Eye isn't just a passive scar, and the Chaos Gods themselves aren't omnipotent architects of this domain. The lore is explicit on one limitation. The Chaos Gods are dependent upon the emotions of mortal creatures, especially the hordes of humanity, for their power and continued existence. They're sustained by mortal belief and mortal suffering. They can expend power to create demons, corrupt mortals, and shape their individual realms within the warp. But they don't present as a single orderly command structure. Their defining characteristic is rivalry. Khorne despises Slaanesh. Tzeentch undermines Nurgle. They unite temporarily and then fracture, consumed by the Great Game, their eternal war for supremacy against each other. The aftermath of the Great Rift makes this dysfunction explicit. Codex material states that had the Chaos Gods worked in unison in the wake of that terrible event, real space might have been utterly consumed by the sprawling madness of the warp. Yet true to their nature, the Dark Brothers saw the anarchy as an opportunity to fulfill their own agendas, to kill, to change, to pollute, to bathe in excess. So divided, they are unable to fully overcome the fierce resistance of the galaxy's inhabitants. The gods had the galaxy tearing itself open in front of them, and they still couldn't cooperate long enough to finish the job. So the Chaos Gods don't fully control each other. They don't fully control the warp at large. And no canon source states they fully control the Eye, the most potent nexus of warp-real space interaction in the galaxy, a place where raw chaos energy has been pouring into physical matter for 11,000 years, fed by the psychic output of a galaxy consumed by war. The absence of hierarchy and emphasis on individual freedom that defines chaos means no single power fully directs what happens there. The Eye is less like a weapon in someone's hand and more like a fire in a room full of accelerants. The gods benefit from it, stoke it, draw power from it, but none of them can fully predict or govern what it produces next. Farseer Eldrad Ulthrin of Craftworld Ulthwé, whose people have studied the Eye longer and with more existential urgency than any human institution, described it in terms that go beyond cartography. All the stars in the sky can't blot out the hateful glare of the red moon's eye. The birthing place of the great enemy pulses with all the malice of a demon that is dreaming, casting its shadow over all we have ever done and all we ever shall. Pulses, dreaming, casting its shadow forward over everything that will happen. The Aeldari, whose civilization's death created the Eye, don't talk about it as a scar. They describe something that is still active. There's a counter-argument, and it's a reasonable one. Multiple canonical descriptions use the word permanent, permanent warp rift, permanent tear. That language implies endurance, not necessarily evolution. And the post-Cadia expansion might simply be the release of a containment system rather than evidence of autonomous growth. Break a dam, and water floods downstream. That doesn't mean the water changed its nature. It means you removed the barrier. But that analogy only holds if you assume the Eye's internal processes have stayed constant for 11 millennia. That what's happening inside the rift right now is identical to what was happening in M31 when the traitor legions first fled there. Nothing in the lore supports that assumption. The demon worlds mutate. New structures appear. The traitor legions pour belief and suffering into their patron gods, who reshape the demon worlds, which generate new conditions, which feed energy back into the warp. It's a feedback loop, and it has been running for over 10,000 years. The one mechanism that slowed it along one critical border, the Necron pylons, is now rubble orbiting the corpse of Cadia. All of which brings the focus back to the man whose campaigns did more than any other to break that barrier. Abaddon launched Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. Later lore reframes those campaigns as steps in a single strategic plan, the Crimson Path, designed not merely to raid Imperial space, but to systematically weaken the barrier between the warp and real space along a route from the Eye to Terra. He destroyed Cadia. He shattered the pylons. He cracked the galaxy in half. The lore never explicitly says Abaddon knew the Great Rift would form in precise terms. It never confirms he understood some specific metamorphosis inside the Eye. But his pattern of actions, targeting pylon networks, destroying Cadia's suppression field, then exploiting the territory that resulted, is consistent with someone pursuing consequences the Imperium failed to foresee. The Imperium looked at the Eye and saw a wound to be contained. Abaddon looked at the same rift and spent 10 millennia systematically removing what held it in check. Did Abaddon understand the consequences better than the Imperium? The sources don't say, but his actions invite the question. The restraints are gone now. The eye is expanding. The Cadian Gate is contested by a handful of holdouts, while the rest of the Imperium fights fires on every other front. Inside the rift, demon worlds continue to mutate and produce phenomena that have no analog in the material universe. The Bissos continues to pump raw chaos energy into a region where physical law collapsed 11 millennia ago. The Chaos Gods fight each other too viciously to coordinate, meaning whatever the eye produces next is unlikely to emerge from any single divine plan. The Imperium's star charts still classify the Eye of Terror as a permanent warp rift, a known threat with known parameters, a fixed location. That classification made sense when Cadia stood, when the pylons held, and when the Eye's borders stayed roughly where they'd been for millennia. None of those conditions exist anymore. The Eye pulses. Its worlds dream new shapes into existence. Its center pours raw chaos energy into a dimension that can no longer fully resist it. Did the Eye of Terror become something new? Canon hasn't confirmed that. What it does confirm is that the Eye is more active, more unstable, and more strategically dangerous than the Imperium ever wanted to admit. If you want more lore deep dives like this one, subscribe. We'll keep going.